given that you are looking from South Australia into the rest of Australia and the world, it's a unique view that sort of says you see the best and worst of the ecosystem, because you're not in the Sydney environment where you might otherwise perceive it to be the centre of Australian conversation, or the Melbourne environment, or Queensland environment. So when you're seeing that Australian sort of landscape, what are you seeing as the current challenge outside of the need to attract talent from the company perspective? Where is the opportunity across Australia, having the opportunity to sort of stand back from it and say, this is, I can see it in its entirety?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll share my little tiny lens. Doesn't necessarily hold too much weight, but I guess anecdotally, if I think about the only Australian clients that we've got specifically in the blockchain space, I guess it's kind of surprising, but they're out of Adelaide. They're actually not out of the eastern states, which is really surprising, actually. And that wasn't because I met these people at a coffee shop or an event. It actually came sort of full roundabout. But I actually found that really surprising, to be honest, is that we're working with a client right now that's based in Adelaide. We've got another client that we've been not working with commercially, but helping them sort of design a blockchain-based system for the last couple of years, also based in Adelaide, which is really interesting. But I guess the difference is these are startups that are building a product from scratch. These are not banks or financial institutions that are trying to innovate. And I guess that's maybe the big difference, Steve, is that in Adelaide, I think there's a very, very small, very young startup ecosystem. Sydney is a hell of a lot more developed. And I think the opportunity in Sydney is getting into the bigger institutional players. When I was down for your guys' event, the Blockchain Australia event, it was great. And where were we sitting? We were sitting in the large institutional buildings. We were sitting in the high rises. We were sitting in the corporates. And I think that's the difference. There's not a lot of that going on in South Australia. In fact, I haven't seen any of that going on in South Australia. The blockchain adoption in South Australia is coming from individuals or very small groups of people. The blockchain adoption in Sydney is coming from individuals and small groups of people, but also from the large institutions that are adopting it and pushing it, which I think is the fundamental difference.
So where do you sit on that view? Because I've often talked about the fact this grassroots bottom-up approach, and I think as an ecosystem, Australians like to think we'll be able to do that. We can build this grassroots up. There's always the perpetual conversation about we can be the new Silicon Valley. Then there's the top-down conversation that says this needs a national approach, it needs a federal approach, you need buy-in from Australian institutions that are already at scale. How do you see those things playing out at the moment? Is it one or the other? Realistically, do we think it's both? Do we think one will dominate? What's your sort of landscape view about those competing ways to grow out an ecosystem?
You probably know a lot more about this than I do, but I guess my observation from a builder's perspective, so we're building stuff for other people. We're not launching our own products, which allows us an interesting lens because we get to see both. We get to see the guys coming up from the bottom, and we get to see the guys coming, pushing down from the top. I guess from the top, as you know, as everybody listening to this will know, that's all about the regulatory environment, right? The big institutions can't do much outside of the regulated environment. So that's more sandbox stuff, and that's really necessary. The guys coming up from the bottom, in my observation, they can do a lot more. They can sort of play a lot more outside of a regulated environment from my observation. So I totally think we need both. I think we absolutely need both, and I think, because I run a global business, I just don't think in terms of Australia or the US or the UK anymore. I really don't. I just think in terms of like what's happening in the world, and the regulatory environments absolutely separate the countries. But I also think there's sort of first mover stuff that trickles down. We're all watching what's happening with Circle at the moment and the USDC. That's got nothing to do with Australia, as far as I know. Yet it's going to have major implications. If they actually do list, which I'm sure they will, if they actually get the banking license, which I don't know if they will or they won't, but if they do, that has very far-reaching implications for stablecoin legitimacy around the world. So to answer your question directly, I think it absolutely needs to be coming from the top and coming from the bottom. But I also think that, it's not like Australia doesn't need to be like an island. We're absolutely able to leverage off what's happening in the US and the UK and make it Australian, make it relevant to the Australian market as well. And I think it's great that companies like Circle are, I don't even know if they're going to get their banking license. It almost doesn't matter. But the fact that it's public and they're doing it and they're trying to do it, it's opening more and more doors, I guess, for what's happening in the Australian blockchain environment.
I think I've been consistent in saying too many conversations within Australia are siloed, Mike. The view that says, I think the border, and I talk to people, particularly when we talk about states versus the federal view as well, that the squiggly line that divides South Australia from Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland actually doesn't matter. And I think that message is slowly getting through. From your experience then, given again the global sort of lens, what's that inbound opportunity look like? What's that direct investment opportunity look like? Because it feels to me that the traction that builds is being built on governments and departments within government saying, what's the economic benefit? What do you see? Where's the pressure? What would you say to people? Here's a really strong signal that this is available to Australians if we're open to it. And likewise, that exportability of the things that we're doing. What's that international lens look like for you as far as direct investment or otherwise?
So, I mean, again, it's my tiny little lens, which is not enormous. But what I see is, we work with some of the biggest blockchain protocols in the world. And what I mean by working with them is I don't mean using them. I mean, they are our clients, right? So they contract us to do work for them. Some of them have a large contingent in Australia, some of them in the US, some of them in the UK, but they're all domiciled in a very regulatory friendly environment. So if we're looking at working with, I won't mention names, but I mean, all of these guys, these are really the leading players. You look at where they're domiciled, it's Zug, or it's a friendly environment. And they're not living there. Very few of these people that we deal with are, you'll see headquarters Zug or headquarters wherever it is. They're not living there. They might be living in the US, the UK, Australia, or Africa, wherever. But I think that's the opportunity is, we've seen it happen with Zug. I mean, that was a place that nobody had even heard of, as far as I know, until blockchain and crypto came around. Now it's like super famous for a friendly environment that allows people to set up and operate in a slightly different structure there. And, I'm not a regulatory expert by any stretch of imagination, but I'm not surprised that at the big events that you guys put on in Sydney and Melbourne, that was the theme. Where is the regulatory environment going? Because until that's at least clear, it's very difficult for, to attract investment into these places at scale because we just don't know what's possible. So not to oversimplify things, but I think the investment opportunity for Australia is figure out a regulatory framework that is really friendly and progressive, and then we'll attract more investment because there's a lot of talent here. The market is not the US size market, but it's a big enough market to at least test ideas and get scale, not US type scale, but absolutely scale. So, there's nothing new here in my thinking, and it's we all say the same things, I guess, in the space, but I guess until we've got that regulatory framework in place, there's still going to be a big hurdle to attract significant and consistent investment into these projects. And it's what we see from our clients is we see people raising money all over the world, but domiciling in a regulatory friendly environment. It's pretty much without fail with every one of our clients. And I'm talking from the startup that's raised $3 million to build all the way up through to the Tezos and the Algorands and the really big players. That's the sort of commonality, is that where they're domiciled, it's a regulatory friendly environment.
From a jobs perspective, that jobs and growth thing is a narrative I think that's important, obviously, to everybody in government and across the country. Who would you go out and hire, Mike? I mean, who do you need that you can't find enough of, or where do you see that future for your business? What are the roles that will be created on the assumption now suddenly you had an influx of talent, because there are a variety of programs looking to sort of activate inbound talent attraction. Austrade, for one, are trying to deliberately grow that sort of element. Who would you like to hire? Who would be the first hire, and who would follow that in your business at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it's no surprise. I mean, our biggest bottleneck in terms of hiring is senior developers, or as we call them, technical leads. And we have an incredibly simple definition of what that is. It's somebody that can lead a project technically with no help, right? We don't have reams and reams of explanations. We have a more detailed explanation for juniors and mids, but senior developers that you can actually put on a project and lead that project. Now, in the context of blockchain, that's even more difficult, because it's obviously a sort of a sub-specialization within being an engineer. We see this all over the world. So this is definitely not just an Australia problem. Like, let me be really clear about that. Australia has also got a shortage of talent, and that's evidenced by a lot of companies now shifting the way that they work from saying, oh, we'll never outsource anything, to, you know what, if we actually want to keep up with velocity, we simply have to outsource some of our work. And we're seeing that through, I guess, the demand that we've never had before. And it's not because we flicked a switch on a marketing engine or a marketing machine. It's just we speak to people all over the world. This problem is pervasive around the whole world. And the trouble here, Steve, is that, you know, the existing talent is only so big. And yes, there's more talent coming through and blockchain application development is becoming more popular, but there's a massive lag effect, right? People don't start studying the stuff this year and then become really attractive to hire next year. You know, the developers we're hiring at this level have got 10, 15, 20 years experience, obviously not in blockchain because it hasn't existed for that long. So there's a massive lag effect. It's going to take a long time for us to catch up, if we even do. You know, digital transformation at large is not slowing down, it's just speeding up. So the direct answer to your question is, who would we hire? We would be hiring more senior software developers. I don't see that supply increasing significantly anytime soon. There's going to be a lag. And
if we're investing in that future, what do you see the role of the likes of tertiary institutions in a formal education setting versus you know, self-taught? How do you see that mix playing out? Because I think you're right in that slow lag in development that says effectively we're planting seeds which will become the trees of the years ahead. But in between now, what could we do to aid that process, on the assumption, again, that most jurisdictions, or many jurisdictions, I should say, are vying for that same talent, Mike? I'm assuming we can't compete in a dollar sense, as in we're geographically remote and otherwise. What does that look like at the moment? Yeah. Where do we take something which already has some degree of momentum? Is it an academic institution? Is it, as I said, formal or informal? Where do you think that is a good place to sort of jump in midstream?
Firstly, you're absolutely right. Like, formally trained, informally trained, there's no right and wrong. You know, we have developers that definitely have no formal education and are incredible seniors because they've just been living this for the last 15 years. We have developers that have got 2, 3, 4 degrees specializing in the space. There's a place for all of them, depending on what you're building. In terms of where can Australia help, the government help, the community help, I mean, I hate to boil it down to money, but the R&D grants are great. Government support is great. And the reason for that is there's just an economic reality that if you're a very good developer at the moment, you can earn a lot of money working for anyone in the world. So if you're sitting in Australia as a developer, you know, you've got an option. Let's take Adelaide. You're sitting in Adelaide, right? Not even Sydney or Melbourne. You're sitting in Adelaide. You're a very good developer. You're a competent developer. You've been working with blockchain applications for the last 3 years and with general development for 10 years before that. You can earn, I don't know, 100, 120, 150 grand a year staying in Adelaide, or you can earn 400 grand a year plus working for a US-based startup, but you can still live in Adelaide. It's a very difficult thing to beat, which means you've now got to come back to, okay, well, what can we offer as a startup or a business that Google can't, or that X US funded startup that's just raised the third round of $20 million can't offer? And then it comes back down more to like the purpose, the culture, the environment. What are we building? Does it actually matter? That's all to say that, like, there is an absolute element of just, you know, of just straight up money, just being able to afford at least a market related salary, which is getting more and more difficult for startups. You know, if you're raising $1 million and that $1 million at your startup has giving you, just for argument's sake, a 1-year runway, and you raised that a year ago, that's no longer 1 year. The change in developer salaries has now cut that runway down to 9 months, 6 months, but you've only got that amount of money. So suddenly what was already a stretch is now a stretch plus 30% or 40% because of the increase in developer costs. So the government does some good stuff with R&D grants, and that's awesome. And I don't want to reduce it down to an oversimplistic sort of statement of saying give startups more money, but it's kind of what I'm going to say, because it's just the cost of building these things has increased so much over the last year that startups, scale-ups, services companies all need help to be able to get up to this market-related level, because otherwise people will just go and work overseas for the same amount of money, and in this remote world, they can still live in Adelaide, Sydney, Melbourne, wherever they want to. It's a real challenge. It really is a real challenge. And I'm speaking to technical founders, services companies, startup companies, my own clients, just saying, is this just me? Am I the only one seeing this, or are you seeing this? And it's now, I'm absolutely convinced that this is the whole world that's seeing this massive crunch on developer talent. Is there a disconnect there, Mike? I mean, because what you're saying makes enormous sense to me. That fact that says you have to be fluid in the way you allocate funds, what the cost of the project would otherwise be. But we live in an environment, and whether it's a sort of a harsh assessment of the like environment, that says they're very measured and considered. You know, you get your money, and 3 months later you get X amount of money, and 12 months later. The international protocol view, in my experience, has been
They just know that the faster you can build this, the faster you can get it to an MVP, the faster you can get it to market, is what you should be doing. So how do we address that challenge? Because on the one hand, I think it is compelling to say to governments, you should assist in this process, but are we lacking that bit in between? Is that where the worlds haven't sort of melded? We've still got a narrower focus that says this is the way startups have always been built. They're measured, they run for 2 years in environments where we're watching things like the DeFi space take off and overnight, enormous funding pools exercise. Is that a fundamental shift that we need to make in the way we view, the way we grow businesses in this country?
I mean, it's a great question, Steve, and it's not one that I'm going to give any mind-blowing answer to. I think I'll just pick up on a couple of things you said. So, overnight successes, you and I both know that overnight successes usually are 10 years in the making. The overnight part is what we see in social media and the media. I interview a lot of founders. Let's talk about DeFi space. All of them have got a story where they worked in X startup, Y startup, Google, what have you, which led them to this point that they now got this quote unquote overnight success in raising $20 million for their lending protocol in DeFi. I think just the first thing that jumped to mind when you were talking about that, it's not the direct question you asked me, but the investor ecosystem in Australia seems to be quite difficult and limited still. I've had the luxury of interviewing very big investors, and I've had the luxury of investing the majority of people who have raised investment. And it's difficult. It's difficult to get significant investment in Australia at a very early stage. The angel investment market doesn't seem to be very developed here. It seems to be quite small and nascent. Australia as a nation is quite risk averse, quite conservative, quite calculated, quite thoughtful. risk averse, calculated, and thoughtful are not things you put synonymous with blockchain startups, so there's a disconnect. You've got to have pretty high risk tolerances. Sure, you've got to be thoughtful, but you basically got to go, this is a 1 in 20 chance. It could work. I'm prepared to throw money at this problem. And you listen to some of the more larger VCs that are backing blockchain startups in the US, they're so much more fluid and open to failure and just going, yes, totally understand this probably won't work, but we've just got to take lots and lots and lots of bets and just keep learning with this in the DeFi space and the NFT space. I think Australia's VC and seed market is still just really, really small. They've been very successful. We've got some major success stories here, but they're not success stories from backing blockchain startups. And my sense, and again, I just really want to caveat this as I don't have a big lens into this, but my sense is that this blockchain space is still considered too risky for the vast majority of VCs and angel investors in Australia. And I think, probably quite smartly, they're kind of just waiting to see what happens before they start throwing real money in. Whereas you look at the UK, the VC market for blockchain is already very sophisticated, with some of the biggest VCs in the world having dedicated portfolios to the space.
And sort of relative terms, Mike, probably handy to sort of benchmark this on that assumption that 0 says we don't want to invest in this space and 10 says we're all in on this space. Where would you place Australian conversations and VCs in that conversation? Is it 1, 2, 3? We're suggesting now it's not yet at 5. We haven't hit that tipping point. Where's the Australian one? And then globally, how would you categorise the appetite that you're seeing in the markets you're dealing with? Where's the number relative to where we are?
Yeah, so again, and I'll just keep caveating this because I'm one person, I'm not a journalist or a particularly plugged in person, but just through the lens of me speaking to tons of startups that want to work with us, none of them are now talking to me about, and this is in Australia as well, trying to raise significant VC money in Australia. All of them, once they've got their seed money or they're bootstrapped or their friends and family round, they're going off to the US to try and raise. So this is probably quite harsh, but I'd put it at like an 8 or a 9. It's almost every conversation is like, yeah, we might have raised some sort of very, very small funding in Australia to get going to build out a POC or maybe an MVP, but that Series A round, we're going to the States. We're looking to the States. And that's a problem, right? Like until we change that narrative of going, no, there's actually some very sophisticated, supportive VCs that get it and want to work with us in Australia, that's going to keep happening. Because if they can go and chase $20 million checks in the US and there's just nowhere to chase those locally, then that's going to be an issue. This is just in blockchain. Obviously there's a lot of investment in FinTech and other areas in Australia, which is great. But, everybody sees us, the US still as the big ticket exits. I mean, Square acquires Afterpay for $38 billion. That narrative is not Australian FinTech acquires Australian FinTech. The narrative is always US FinTech acquires X territory fintech. So it's tricky because that capital flow and that IP then is kind of just flowing out of Australia and into the US, which is obviously something we want to try and change.
Jumping back to the NONA story then, happenstance, planned in South Australia isn't, as you said, naturally, it wouldn't necessarily be the first place that jumps to mind. It might have been for you. Is it happenstance that you find yourself building a global business out of South Australia, or is that a deliberate decision?
Yeah, the local Adelaide, I always feel so bad because when I arrived here, I got asked to speak a lot. And it's like the first or second question would always be like, Mike, you're in Adelaide. What made you choose Adelaide? And my answer was, I didn't choose Adelaide. So, and it breaks my heart because I want to say that I chose it, but the reality is, we left South Africa as a family for personal reasons. South Africa is incredible. There's amazing talent. It's my favorite place in the world, Cape Town, where I'm from. The crime is pretty bad though, and we sort of chose, that we want to raise our kids in a sort of more safer environment. Very sad decision. I'm a huge fan of Cape Town and South Africa. That's why we moved. Nothing to do with business. Long story short, we applied for the visa process. It's very difficult to get in to Australia from South Africa. We got in and we sent the government an email saying, thanks for having us. We'll see you in Sydney in March 2012. And they said, 2019. And they said, no, you won't. You can choose Adelaide or Darwin. Oh. So we were like, shit, okay. Well, anyway, long story short, we chose Adelaide. Look, we're very happy here. Would I choose to build a global business from Adelaide? Probably not. However, I can work from anywhere in the world. It actually makes very little difference. So I'm not hiring in South Australia. We're hiring predominantly still in South Africa because we have a strong network. There's amazing talent there. We're servicing into Australia, but no, I don't think I would choose to build a global software development business from Adelaide. Having said that, we've just bought a house. We're pretty settled. We're pretty happy here. We're hanging around. We're not going anywhere. That does kind of break the local people's hearts when I tell that, because they always get really excited about like, oh, look here, you see somebody's chosen. And I'm like, I didn't choose it, guys, but I'm here and I'm really happy and we're staying. But I really just need to emphasize the point that we've been working with clients around the world from Cape Town and Johannesburg for years, far before COVID. It used to be quite a struggle in certain instances to, we'd be chatting to a client in New York and they'd say, yeah, but Mike, it's you guys versus the guy down the road that we can just walk into their office. That has just disappeared completely. That whole conversation doesn't even happen anymore. It literally isn't even a factor. We have hardly any clients in Africa. Almost all of our clients are spread throughout the world. That conversation just doesn't even come up anymore. They might say, oh, by the way, where's your team based? And I'll say Cape Town. And then we'll usually get into a conversation about Cape Town. There is no conversation about, oh, but how do you handle remote teams? And it's amazing, I think, for the global markets. Now you've got Australian businesses that want to be servicing into the US. I think the borders are lower than they've ever been, and those barriers are smaller than they've ever been. So I'm sitting in Adelaide. Our team is growing. We've just hired 5 developers that are onboarding. I get pretty sad when I think about not being able to physically go and hang out with them, because I usually go back to Cape Town every 90 days. That doesn't happen in COVID. But I don't think it's a hindrance from building a business globally at all. I think it's really easy now.
The reason I like that story, this is the set of circumstances you found yourself in. This is what you're doing, and you're creating a big business in relation to it. So it isn't this manicured version of history and the truth. On the NONA side as well, then the business snapshot. Where are you today? What is the main work that you do? How is that sort of playing out at the moment?
Yeah, so snapshot, we're growing nicely. We don't want to grow too quickly from a people perspective. So I think we'll be 37 people by the end of these onboards, these 5 hires we've just made. We're very proud of these 5 hires because at the moment to find 5 high quality engineers in any business is incredibly difficult. We only work with full-time people. We don't outsource. We don't work with freelancers. Our typical project is a team of 3 to 4 developers and a project manager sitting on a project. Our absolute sweet spot is when we're working on our stack, which I won't bore you with, but on our stack, on a FinTech project, which has an element of blockchain. So what a lot of people don't realize is like blockchain application development is actually just application development with a very small percentage of blockchain integrations, API connections, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really happy with where we are. We made a big focus. I wouldn't call it a pivot, but we've narrowed our focus in the last 2 years to only work with FinTech. It was quite scary because when you do that, you turn away a lot of customers. That was a fantastic move. 100% of our portfolio now is fintech. I'd say about 50% of that is blockchain specific, and we're really happy. I think it's great for us to be able to say that we've been working with blockchain applications for like 3 or 4 years already. We built our first NFT project in 2018. I mean, that was before most people even knew what NFTs were. Yeah, I think it's a great time to be alive, Steve. We're just seeing the most crazy innovations. It's incredible. You know, the DeFi space is still very misunderstood by me, by everyone except the people that are actually building these things. But there's just enormous potential. The other thing that I'll say is that, you know, we get a lot of inbound interest. We speak to a lot of people on my podcast. I'm very fortunate that I get to speak to some of the world's leading fintech and blockchain founders. And what I can tell you from a blockchain perspective is there is not a single fintech founder that I'm talking to today that is not at least exploring blockchain. So even the most conservative cross-border remittance and Swift-esque type fintechs, when I talk to them now, might not be on their website, but they're absolutely exploring stablecoins. Or if it's a savings app, they're absolutely exploring Bitcoin rewards or Ethereum rewards. It's absolutely pervasive now in terms of at least exploring it. Whereas even 2 years ago, you had the naysayers. Now the guys are just kind of going, look, whether or not we like it, we've got to be exploring the blockchain elements that are going to just give us the edge. So it's really fun, and it's really exciting to be a part of building all of these things.
And the best social channels, or the best place to communicate with you then, Mike? How should people come looking for you? Is it the website? Is it some of the social channels? Where is the first port of call for people that are looking to reach out?
Yeah, so I mean, our website is pretty simple. It's nona.digital, just like that. So www.nona.digital. I'm really active on LinkedIn, so you can find me, Mike Scott, on LinkedIn. And then the podcast will probably give the most value to your listeners. The podcast is called The FinTech Founder Journey, which you'll find on any podcast channel. Between those 3 things, you'll definitely find us. And I'd love to chat to anyone who wants to chat.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for the chat.